Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and in this series, we're speaking in Norse code. Yeah! All right, I'm calling this episode Mud City Magic. Have fun, guys. Okay, so here we go. All right, so deciphering the Norse code begins when my dear friend Dora Vernon sent me some videos she took at this place. And this is St. Talon's Church in Cornwall. And there are a lot of amazing things about St. Talon's Church in Cornwall. The first being that it's one of England's oldest churches, dating back to the 6th century. And so that means it was probably founded by one of those wandering barefoot monk types like St. Columba and St. Kevin, right? Remember these guys? Right? And it's purported that the altar at St. Talon's is situated on the same spot as the pagan altar of the Celtic Cornish people. Right? I think that's really amazing. And that the altar sits on a ley line as well. You know, I mean, of course, there's no proving any of that. It's complete speculation, as is the saint that St. Talon's is named after, right? St. Talonus. He appears to have been the invention of some 15th century priests at St. Talon's who feared not having a saint attached to the church would hurt its attendance, right? So they invented one out of thin air to keep up with all the new churches that were springing up in the 15th century in England that all had patron saints attached to them, right? So they had saint envy over at Talon's, right? And St. Talon's Church also has some of the best preserved pre-Reformation woodwork left in England, right? And we're going to take a look at some of that down the line, along with what else Talon's Church has. And that's a tomb or a shrine to the Granville family, including one Sir Bevil Granville. And so Dora's spotlight on him piqued my curiosity enough to rabbit hole him a little bit. And, you know, as these things go, Sir Bevil has a connection to Mud City and Baltimore. And I'm sure Dora had no idea about this when she was there. But you see, Sir Bevil was another royalist who fought for King Charles in the Right of Kings, right? And he was mortally wounded at the Battle of Lansdowne. There's even a monument to him there on the site today, right? And that's because his family was, and perhaps still is, a very wealthy and important family in England. I'm sure that has something to do with why this memorial is there. You know, I don't know. But when I learned that he was wounded at the Battle of Lansdowne, my fat senses lit up because we have a Lansdowne in Baltimore, right? Technically it's in Baltimore County, but it feels a whole lot more like the city down there, right? But, you know, anyway, I thought this was really amazing, and I immediately wanted to find out if there was any connection between the two, right? So, and I found out that Lansdowne is named after former British Prime Minister William Petty Fitzmaurice, right, who was the first Marquis of Lansdowne. And the unbelievable thing about him, as far as Mud City is concerned, is that he was Prime Minister of England during the tail end of the American Revolution. Right? He was in office from July 4th, and trust me, I don't think it's a coincidence that he started on July 4th, right? And he serves until the 26th of March, 1783. You know, so this is 9 months. And so 9 months is apparently enough time to do the job it seems that he was specifically appointed to do, right? And that was negotiating the terms of the emancipation between the new American government and the British Empire, right? And he's widely criticized in England for what he consents to the upstart colonists in their fledgling government. And this is very interesting because Lansdowne, at least where Google Earth drops a pin in it anyway, is exactly 3 miles from Mount Clair as the raven flies, right? Here's the pinpoint for Lansdowne on Google Earth, right? The end point is Mount Clair here, right? 3 miles, you know, I could have hit that maybe a little bit better, but to the doorway, right? And so this makes me wonder, you know, how much of what is Lansdowne today was at one time Carroll property? You know, I'm certain it must have been, because I don't know if this is just my apophenia running wild or not, but I find this very intriguing that Mount Clair, where Mud City has the Revolutionary War being staged, and land named after the man who negotiated the terms of emancipation, are so close together. Because while Prime Minister Petty was widely criticized for his concessions to the colonists, he was, in fact, being very shrewd. The concession of the vast Appalachian areas was designed to facilitate the growth of the American population and create lucrative markets for British merchants without any military or administrative costs to Britain. So think about that for a second, right? The right Englishmen were still going to get theirs because America was still heavily reliant on British industry and mercantile concerns. You know, so when is an empire not an empire? when its citizens give over their money without the threat of force. And I have to wonder how much of these terms of emancipation the Lord Marquis of Lansdowne creates were based on Richard Stockton's ideas for a plan of self-government for America, independent of Parliament, without renouncing the crown. This is really kind of unbelievable, right? Because he who walks away with the most money wins, right? I think isn't that the model that they're working with? A lot of English merchants got very rich in the years following America's independence, right? Or so the record tells us anyway. And so I just love this story of how Lansdowne in Baltimore County got its name, right? Because it just fits so perfectly into the Mud City paradigm, right? And there's no way that we're done with Sir William Petty here, right? The Marquis of Lansdowne. I'm sure we're going to see him again, right? But closing out on him for this video, the title of the Marquis of Lansdowne was an honorary title created for him upon his retirement from active politics, which is interesting because this kind of brings us right back around to Sir Bevil Granville, whose grandson, George, goes on to be styled first Baron Lansdowne in the peerage of England under Queen Anne, so considerably earlier than William Petty Fitzmaurice. And the Right Honorable George here, he even serves as Secretary of War from 1710 to 1712. But he's the only one. He's the only Lord Lansdowne because he dies without a male heir. And so I guess that's how the title is available for use for William Petty later on. And I do have to wonder if there could be any other relation between the Granvilles and the Pettys, the Fitzmaurices. I don't know. I didn't really string that out because I kind of thought this story was done, just another nice and easy bit of Mud City magic that I could cull from Dora's trip to Talon's church. But in reading more about Sir Bevil's grandson, George, the first Baron of Lansdowne, he erects a monument to his grandfather and to his family's loyalty to the Stuarts that reads thusly: "Here lies all that was mortal of the most noble and truly valiant Sir Bevil Granville of Stow in the county of Cornwall, Earl of Corbeil and Lord Thorny and Granville in France and Normandy, descended in a direct line from Robert, second son of ye warlike Rollo, first Duke of Normandy." Right? And so the Granvilles trace their origins back to Normandy from well before the Norman invasion of 1066. And not only that, but to the first Duke of Normandy, whose name was apparently Rollo, right? So I Rolloed myself over to his wiki page, and it turns out that Rollo is a Viking. He was a Viking who became the first ruler of Normandy. And so apparently historians have been losing sleep for centuries over Rollo's true origins, who he really was, right? And so the Cliff Notes version is that Rollo was a Norseman of some means who staked a sizable claim in what is today Normandy. And with shrewd political alliances and a good army at his disposal, he's able to secure this fairly independent dukedom, which then goes on to spawn the British Empire, right? But where did he come from? And historians do have some alleged period sources that name a couple of people who fit the bill. One of the sources alludes to a Danish origin for Rollo, having him come from Denmark, right? And there's another that has him come from Norway. And at first I didn't understand what the big deal was, Why did they need to mention this? What was the controversy here? Why was it so important where they were from? What's the big deal? And so the big deal is, of course, is that Rollo here is the forefather to the British royals. So I guess finding out where Rollo comes from could be important, right? And a joint Norwegian-French research team believed that they could solve this mystery and prove once and for all that Norwegian Viking noble Ganger Hrolf was Rollo, and therefore forefather of the British royal family. And they hoped to do this by extracting DNA samples from the remains of Rollo's oldest known descendants, his grandson Richard the Fearless and great-grandson Richard the Good, or Richards 1 and 2. And on February 29th, 2016, and I think this is really amazing that this is a leap year. That can't be a coincidence, or maybe it is, I don't know, right? But they open their respective tombs and are able to retrieve a lower jawbone from Richard II's tomb that had teeth in it, right? So expectations were very high that usable DNA would be found, right? But natch, it remains unresolved, right? And this is because the skeletal remains were so old and had been stored in lead containers, so it was not possible to retrieve DNA and thus find out where they may have come from. And so this was very disappointing to the research team, as you can imagine, but they figured while they had these bones out, they decided to carbon date them. And the results of the carbon dating blew these researchers' minds, and it blew my mind as well, right? Because they found out that the remains that they had nothing to do with Rollo at all. And that, in fact, according to the carbon dating, one was from around the year 700, or roughly 200 years before Rollo was even supposed to exist, right? And the other was from 250 to 300 years before our era. That's 300 BC. To you and me, right? Or approximately 1,200 years before Rollo was supposed to be even born. This is absolutely crazy. How do remains 2 and 1,200 years older than their respective tombs, then the respective tombs they're buried in, get there? How is that possible? But the historians have this covered, right? They tell us that it's not entirely uncommon for the contents of graves to not match the names on them, right? And so all of this is sounding a little like the Pulaski principle to me, and the mix-up that happened here, right? So bones get mixed up, do they? Remains don't necessarily match the names on the tombs or headstones, huh? Okay, I kind of get that, but to be off by 1,200 years? But the historians have that covered too, right? Because they know that many cities in Northern Europe moved on from cemeteries and churches after the Vikings started their raids. And many churches also had to be rebuilt, right? So essentially what they're saying is that the bones got mixed up during one of the many times the tombs had to be moved with the church over the last millennia. And I think it's like 3 or 4 times. And that's how a skeleton 1,200 years before its time got there, right? And they speculate that he may have been a pre-Roman Celtic chief from Fécamp in France, and that's where the tombs Richard are located, right? And so they reckon that the early Normans just reused these Celtic burial grounds. But there's something that doesn't sit right with me about this story, and I don't know what it is, but it feels a little like they're covering their tracks with something here. I don't know. Especially because this story seemed to start as an attempt to genetically certify, for lack of a better term, the British royal family. If they could prove where Rollo came from, right, then they could prove where Queen Elizabeth came from, right? And so this is all very curious to me, and I wanted to find out more, and I found this very informative blog that I hope to remember to link. And at the bottom, he says that one tooth had been sent out for strontium isotope analysis, whatever that is, and that the results could determine where the man had spent his childhood. Now, they're not really clear on whose bones were whose, and so I don't know if the jawbone is the 1,200 year before its time or the 200 year before its time skeleton, but since all of this happened in 2016, and it's 2022 today, I thought, well, maybe, did they follow up on this strontium isotope analysis, or maybe did they do more DNA tests, because surely the technology has improved since 2016, right? So I decided that I should Google the Rollo Richards DNA Project's co-manager and project initiator, Sturla Ellingvag, to see if there was any interviews with him, or, did he publish any more papers about this research, right? And so here he is, right? And he has good reason for the long face, right? Because Sturla has found himself on the hot seat, right? The first article that I came upon when I Googled his name was this one. DNA researcher believes he is subject to smear campaign. And Sturla believes this because he's run afoul of his fellow colleagues and research scientists over how some of them are treating the results of a multidisciplined research study that he participated in. A research study used as the basis for this paper, Population Genomics of the Viking World, which was published by Nature magazine on September 16, 2020. And this paper has changed the face of history as we knew it. Right? Because this paper, or some of its authors anyway, aimed to prove that there was no Viking race as we may think of them. And in the wake of this paper, every major scientific and history journal, from National Geographic to IGN, right? And we're going to get to IGN a bit later, right? To Smithsonian Magazine and Science.org, and the list is endless. ScienceDaily.com, and the New York Times, the New York Times too. They all want us to know that things are very different for the Vikings today, and they all want us to know on the same date. I mean, look at this: September 16th, Science Daily. September 16th, New York Times. Let's see, what do we got here? September 18th for Smithsonian. Right, that's just probably a publication date thing. Right, Science.org doesn't have a date. What else did I clip? National Geographic on the 16th. IGN on the 22nd. So either all on the same day or within the week of the publication of that Nature paper. If this doesn't scream coordinated rollout, then I don't know what does, right? They want as many people to know about this as possible, as quickly as possible. This paper is one big history booster injected right into the public subconscious, right? And these new ideas take hold so well that 2 years later, in 2022, no more authoritative a source than History Today, the world's leading serious history magazine, which has been in publication since 1951 and whose very first issue has the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury on the cover. Right? Are you kidding me? Right? 2 years after this landmark nature study, right? They want us to know that it's time to say goodbye to the Vikings, right? And that there was never such a thing as a Viking in the medieval period. And I'd just like to draw your attention to this 666 hiding out in this publication date. You think that's a coincidence? I guess it could be. I don't know. But regardless, today, History Today states that the term Viking, as it is commonly used, is misleading, warping our perception of the Middle Ages, and it should be retired, right? Just erase it from the lexicon, right? And their justification for this is that the word Viking is racist, right? The word Viking seems to have entered modern English in the early 19th century, when medieval Icelandic literature was beginning to be translated into major European languages. Initially, it was used in the original medieval sense, and we're going to get onto all of that later, right? But by the 1860s, not the 1860s, it was starting to be used to describe all early medieval warriors from Scandinavia, right? And the final development, the final development of the Viking was the ethnicization of the word that allows for the use of terms such as Viking farms, Viking towns, and Viking women and children. I think it's interesting that, Viking warrior isn't on here, or Viking king, or anything like that. That's kind of interesting. They say that this ethnicization, right, is much more recent and has gradually crept up since the Second World War. We got to keep that in our back pocket for later on as well, right? Because this is insidious. Right? By linking military prowess and savagery to an entire ethnic group, it encourages its appropriation by racial supremacists. Right? And I think we all know who they're talking about here. But wait a minute. Stella says, not so fast. Right? Like I said, he runs afoul of his constituents when he criticizes the dissemination of the research and the interpretation of the findings. Right? He says that no data had been used from the areas in Norway where Vikings primarily came from. Right? Now, this is quite an accusation against his colleagues. Essentially, he's alleging that they skewed the research toward a specific result. And was the desired result the removal of Vikings from history? And what does the erasure of Vikings from history mean for the royal family and for the story of the Normans? They're going to have to change all of this, right? And what, if any, effect does the scrubbing of Vikings from history have on modern identity politics? We're going to take a look at all of that and a whole lot more in the next pillaging episode, right? So until then, remember guys, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies. Cheers.